He was outnumbered 90-1. Snow swirled in the gray Belgian afternoon as First Sergeant Leonard Funk stepped around the corner of a farmhouse and stopped dead in his tracks. The yard that should have been full of disarmed prisoners was now a sea of field gray uniforms and steel helmets. German soldiers everywhere, rifles in their hands, machine guns being set up, voices barking orders in harsh, clipped German. At his feet, 4 American GIs knelt in the snow, their hands clasped behind their heads, their faces pale with the realization that something had gone terribly, fatally wrong. A German officer broke from the crowd, stomping toward Leonard with furious purpose, snow crunching under his boots. He shoved the cold muzzle of an M40 submachine gun into Leonard's stomach and screamed at him in German. Leonard didn't understand the words. He didn't have to. He read the meaning in the man's eyes, in the gun pressed against him, in the 90 rifles that could swing his way at any moment. Logic said it was over. You don't beat 90 armed men with 1 gun and 4 kneeling prisoners. You don't walk away from a mistake like this. You surrender, raise your hands, and pray the enemy remembers the Geneva Convention. But standing there in that farmhouse yard, with snow biting his face and a foreign voice shrieking inches from him, Leonard Funk did something that no one on either side expected. He started laughing. It wasn't a nervous chuckle or a polite smile. It was a raw, full-bodied laugh that shook his shoulders and bent him slightly at the waist, as if the entire situation, the gun in his gut, the screaming officer, the ring of enemies, was the funniest thing he had ever seen. The German officer's face twisted from rage into confusion. Some of his own men cracked uneasy grins. The 4 Americans on their knees stared in disbelief. The other GI standing near Leonard felt his heart slam against his ribs, wondering if their first sergeant had finally snapped. No one in that frozen yard knew it yet, but in less than a minute, 21 Germans would be dead. Dozens more would be sprawled in the snow, and this laughing paratrooper from Pennsylvania would carve his name forever into the history of the Second World War. To understand how that happened, how an ordinary American kid became the man who laughed in the face of 90 armed enemies, you have to go back, long before the snow, before the war, to the smoke and steel of western Pennsylvania. Leonard Alfred Funk Jr. was born in 1916 in Braddock Township, Pennsylvania, a steel town crouched along the Monongahela River, just east of Pittsburgh. The nights there glowed orange from the blast furnaces, and the air smelled like hot metal and coal dust. It was the kind of place where boys grew up fast and childhood ended early. By the time Leonard finished high school in 1934, the Great Depression was grinding through its 5th brutal year. Jobs were scarce, money was scarce, and dreams of college were, for most families, nothing more than fantasies you kept to yourself. Leonard had already been helping care for his younger brother, already learning what it meant to put someone else's needs before his own. Work wasn't about ambition. It was about survival and responsibility. The quiet, unglamorous kind that never made the papers, but shaped the man who would one day walk into a yard full of enemies and start laughing. For a while, life followed the expected track. Odd jobs, helping family, doing what millions of Americans did in those lean years, endure day by day. Then the world beyond Pennsylvania caught fire. By 1941, Europe and Asia were engulfed in war. Nations fell, armies rolled over borders. America watched, wary and divided, until Congress extended the draft. And Leonard's number came up. He was 24 years old, 5'5", about 140 pounds. The kind of man an Army doctor might glance at and quietly steer toward a typewriter, not a rifle. On paper, he didn't look like much of a warrior. But paper doesn't tell you how a man handles fear. When the Army offered him a path, Leonard didn't choose safety. He volunteered for something most Americans had barely heard of: parachute troops, men who would jump from airplanes into enemy territory, surrounded from the moment their boots hit the ground. To the average soldier in 1941, that sounded like madness. Why jump out of a perfectly good airplane just to land in the middle of the enemy? But the men who raised their hands understood something deeper. Somebody had to go first. And Leonard was willing. Airborne training was designed to break you. It wasn't just about muscles, it was about will. Weeks of relentless running, climbing, obstacle courses, falls, bruises, and the mental torture of watching other men quit. Half of them washed out. Leonard didn't. He earned his wings and a spot in Company C, 1st Battalion, 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment, the unit that would later become part of the 82nd Airborne Division, the All-Americans. These were men who would jump into the dark long before the first tank crossed a border, men who would see the enemy's homeland from behind, not from a safe line on a map. By late 1943, Leonard was in England. Rainy days, muddy fields, endless drills. At night, he could hear the distant thunder of Allied bombers heading east and returning with fewer engines and fewer planes. He was older than many of the other men, 27 to their 19 or 20. They brought energy and bravado. He brought steadiness. He didn't bark the loudest or tell the wildest stories, but under fire, soldiers don't follow the loudest man. They follow the one whose hands don't shake when it's time to move forward. When the Allies have finally prepared to cross the English Channel and rip open Hitler's fortress Europe, Leonard's place in the line was already marked. On the night of June 5th and the early hours of June 6th, 44, he stepped into a sea transport with his gear hanging off him like lead, a Thompson submachine gun, ammunition pouches, grenades, rations, medical kit, everything he would need if the worst happened and he found himself alone. Outside, the sky over Normandy was on fire. German anti-aircraft guns spat tracers and shrapnel into the night. The rumble of engines shook the floor under his boots. Somewhere below, beaches waited, and behind them, fields, forests, and towns full of enemy soldiers who had been preparing for this invasion for years. The plane flew low, dangerously low, to avoid the heaviest concentrations of flak, too low for a safe parachute drop. But there was no choice. The men in that fuselage were going out when the light turned green, whether the numbers made sense or not. When the light snapped on, Leonard stepped into the screaming wind and darkness. The prop blast hit him like a wall, a heartbeat of chaos. Then the parachute snapped open, and for a moment the world went eerily quiet. Below him, occupied France. Enemies in every direction. No clear lines, no safe zones, no rally point with a big sign saying, "This way, easy company." He hit the ground hard. Pain shot up his leg, his ankle twisted badly. The kind of injury that would have meant a cast and crutches back home. Here, it meant that every step from that moment on would feel like a knife under his skin. But he could stand. He could move. And there were other men out there, scattered, lost, and alone. He buried his parachute, took a breath, and started walking into the dark. Over the next hours, Leonard did what came naturally. He found people who needed a leader, and he led. One man here, 3 over there, a couple huddled behind a hedgerow. Soon he had gathered a mixed group of paratroopers from different units, different companies, all of them cut off and looking for someone who seemed to know where to go. 18 men eventually fell in behind him. For 10 days, this improvised band moved through German-held country. They traveled at night, hid during the day, and fought when they had to. Leonard, limping on his injured ankle, insisted on walking point, putting himself in front where the danger was thickest. 10 days behind enemy lines, 40 miles of fields, villages, and roads that belonged to the enemy. When they finally reached friendly forces on June 17th, every single man was alive. Not one casualty. For that, Leonard received the Silver Star, the Bronze Star, and a Purple Heart. But medals were only metal. What mattered more was what his men had learned. When everything fell apart, when their maps and their plans meant nothing, this quiet sergeant from Pennsylvania had not. The war, however, wasn't done with him. In September 1944, the Allies tried something bold and risky, Operation Market Garden. Paratroopers would drop into the Netherlands to seize a chain of bridges, while armored columns raced up a single highway to meet them. If it worked, the Allies could leap into Germany's industrial heartland and maybe end the war by Christmas. If it failed, well, soldiers don't get to veto the plan. They just carry it out. Leonard and the 5/8 dropped into Holland, landing in flat, open country under a wide gray sky. The mission sounded straightforward on paper. Secure the drop zones, support the assault on critical bridges, hold until the tanks arrived. Reality, as always, had other ideas. While moving with a small patrol near one of the objectives, Leonard spotted something that twisted his gut. 3 German 20mm anti-aircraft guns, dug into a good position on high ground and firing into the sky. They were shredding the slow, fragile gliders, bringing in more Allied troops and equipment. He took cover, glassed the position, counted heads. Roughly 20 Germans manned the guns and provided security. Leonard had 3 men with him. Textbooks say you need 3 attackers for every 1 defender when storming a fortified position. Leonard had the exact opposite, but he also had a clear picture in his mind of those gliders full of men who never got a say in where those guns were placed. He knew what a 20mm shell did to unarmored aircraft and the people inside. He made his choice. Leonard led his 3-man patrol straight at the position. They moved fast and low, using every scrap of cover, then burst into the gun pit with grenades and automatic fire. The security troops died before they really understood what was happening. The gunners had no time to swing their weapons down from the sky to ground level. When the smoke cleared, the German guns were silent. The sky above them, for a while at least, was safer for every glider pilot and every trooper strapped into a wooden seat, praying to make it to the ground in one piece. For that, Leonard was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the 2nd highest award for valor in the U.S. Army, 1 step below the Medal of Honor. By the fall of 1944, his uniform already carried more decorations than most soldiers would ever see. But history wasn't done calling his name. In December 1944, the Germans launched a desperate counterattack through the Ardennes forest, the Battle of the Bulge. Snow blanketed the trees, roads turned to ice, and the sky stayed overcast, grounding Allied aircraft. Into this frozen maze, Hitler threw hundreds of thousands of men, tanks, and artillery pieces, aiming for the vital port of Antwerp. For the Americans, it was chaos. Thin lines of tired, understrength units were slammed by fresh German forces, roads jammed with retreating vehicles and civilians. Entire platoons and companies were overrun or cut off. And amid that chaos came an event that would scar the conscience of the American Army, the Malmedy Massacre. Near a crossroads not far from the town of Malmedy, a column from the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion ran headlong into an SS armored spearhead. They were not frontline infantry. They were observers, communications men, support troops. After a brief fight, overwhelmed and outgunned, they surrendered. They were marched into a field, hands up, disarmed, prisoners of war. Then, without warning, the SS opened fire. Machine guns swept the line. Men trying to run were cut down. Wounded soldiers were finished off with shots to the head. 84 Americans died in that snowy field. A handful survived by lying motionless among the dead, letting German boots crunch past them, listening to laughter and voices, holding their breath as the cold gnawed at their flesh. As those survivors crawled away after dark and reached American lines, their story spread. At first as rumor, then as whispered fact, then as grim certainty. The enemy, at least some of them, were not honoring the old unwritten rules. Prisoners were being murdered. For many Americans, it changed the war. Surrender stopped looking like a lifeline and started looking like Russian roulette with too many loaded chambers. When Leonard heard about Malmedy, something hardened inside him. He had already seen death in Normandy and Holland. He had watched friends bleed out in fields and along ditches whose names no one back home would ever remember. But this was different. This was men who had done the right thing. Hands up, weapons down, being shot where they stood. He made himself a promise. He would never surrender to the Germans. Not because he was fearless, but because he knew what surrender might now mean. That private vow, made in the cold with the news of murder echoing through the ranks, would be waiting for him on a January afternoon in a Belgian village called Holzheim. By late January 1945, the German offensive had stalled. The Allies were pushing back, clawing their way through snow-choked forests and shattered villages. Company C, 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment, received orders to take Holzheim, a place most Americans could not find on a map, but one that mattered in the jigsaw puzzle of roads, ridges, and crossroads that shaped the front lines. The problem was stark. The company was under strength. The regular executive officer had been killed. Men were missing, wounded, dead, or simply worn down by months of relentless combat. Into that gap stepped First Sergeant Leonard Funk. On paper, he was the senior non-commissioned officer, the backbone of the company. In reality, with officers gone and ranks thinned, he was now acting executive officer, second in command of a unit expected to do a job it no longer had the numbers for. He studied the roster and saw the truth. There weren't enough riflemen to clear a defended village. So he went somewhere combat leaders don't usually recruit from, the company headquarters area. In tents and makeshift shelters sat clerks, cooks, supply men. They handled paper, food, fuel, ammunition, all the things an army needs but rarely glorifies. Some had never fired a shot in anger. Leonard walked in among them and stripped away the distance between rear and front. "You're infantry now," he told them in so many words. "Grab your weapons. We're taking that village." Somewhere in that group, a cook tightened his jaw. A supply corporal swallowed hard. A clerk who thought his war would be fought with pencils wrapped his fingers around a cold rifle stock. They formed up, a makeshift platoon of men whose training had been rusty at best, whose last battle might have been over missing rations, not machine gun nests, and they followed Leonard out into the snow. The march to Holzheim was a punishing 15 miles through waist-deep drifts under a sky that seemed to press the cold right into their bones. Artillery shells burst intermittently in the distance and occasionally closer, throwing black earth and white snow into the air. Men stumbled, cursed, pulled each other upright. Leonard kept moving, so they kept moving. When they reached the outskirts of Holzheim, there was no rest, no hot coffee, no chance to warm numb fingers. Leonard set to work, breaking down the problem the way a good sergeant does, house by house, street by street. The village wasn't big. 15 houses, a few outbuildings, narrow lanes half choked with snow. But Germans were in almost every building, watching from windows, rifles ready, machine guns crouched behind curtains and sandbags. Leonard took his mixture of veteran paratroopers and newly minted riflemen and led them in. Doorways exploded inward. Grenades boomed, shouted commands and screams mingled in the cramped spaces as rooms were cleared at muzzle flash distance. It wasn't pretty or clean, but it worked. House after house fell. By the time the smoke settled, Company C had captured about 30 German prisoners in that sector without losing a single American in the immediate assault. On the far side of the village, another American unit rounded up roughly 50 more, 80 prisoners in total, 80 enemy soldiers, many of them still angry, still defiant, still dangerous. They were herded into the yard of a farmhouse, a rough rectangle of trampled snow, bordered by stone walls and outbuildings. The prisoners clustered together, their breath steaming in the cold air, faces sullen, eyes watching everything. Leonard looked at his exhausted men. They had marched, fought, and bled their way into this village. There was still scattered resistance to mop up. Isolated German soldiers holed up in attics, cellars, or behind half-ruined walls. He did the best he could with what he had. Only 4 men could be spared to guard the 80 prisoners. He gave them their orders: keep the prisoners here, stay alert, help will come when it can. Then he turned and went back into the village, carrying with him the weight of a decision he didn't have the luxury to question. Somewhere in the swirling snow beyond his sight, another German patrol moved. 10, maybe 20 men, wrapped in white camouflage capes that blended with the winter landscape. From a distance, in that blur of white cloth and rifles, they looked unsettlingly like American troops in winter gear. They approached the farmhouse yard. The 4 guards saw figures in white and hesitated for a fatal second, trying to make sense of what they were seeing. By the time they realized the truth, the enemy was upon them. The Germans crashed into the thin American guard, wrestling rifles away, slamming men to the ground, forcing the guards to their knees with hands locked behind their heads. Shouts in German rippled through the yard as the prisoners surged forward. The same men who had raised their hands in surrender minutes before now lunged for the pile of rifles and machine guns. They grabbed weapons with desperate eagerness, fingers flying over bolts and magazines, muscle memory reawakening in a heartbeat. The yard transformed. Where there had been 80 disarmed prisoners, there was now a hastily reconstituted fighting force. Roughly 90 Germans, some still straightening their uniforms, others already snapping into battle positions. A German officer, likely a lieutenant or captain, took charge quickly. He pointed, shouted, pushed men into position. Machine guns were dragged to vantage points. Rifles were distributed, voices echoed off the stone walls as the plan took shape. Hit Company C from the rear when its men were scattered and tired, expecting safety behind them. If that plan had unfolded as intended, the result could have been a slaughter. Meanwhile, Leonard, somewhere else in the shattered village, finished his latest task. The shooting had died down in his immediate area. The next item on his mental checklist: check on the prisoners, make sure the guards were holding, see whether reinforcements had arrived to take the burden off those 4 men. He walked back through narrow lanes, past damaged houses and burned fences, the crunch of snow under his boots, the only sound for a few moments. He turned the corner of the farmhouse and stepped into a nightmare. Instead of a cluster of disarmed prisoners watched by 4 armed Americans, he saw a churning mass of Germans, many with rifles slung or already at the ready. His 4 guards were on their knees, dedumbed, their hands forced behind their heads. Another American stood near Leonard, equally stunned, equally vulnerable. Time seemed to slow. Leonard's mind took in the details with brutal clarity. The ring of enemy faces, the muzzles of their guns, the officer already striding toward him. Every scenario he'd ever learned, every lesson from years of combat, said the same thing. This was unwinnable. The German officer closed the distance quickly. He thrust the barrel of his M40 into Leonard's stomach, so hard it must have left a bruise, and screamed a command in German, something like, "Hands up!" or "Drop your weapon." Leonard didn't know the words, but he knew the intent. The officer screamed again, louder this time, spittle flying, veins standing out in his neck. 90 German soldiers watched, half circle tightening. 4 Americans knelt in the snow, waiting for whatever came next. The math was simple and unforgiving. And then Malmedy rose up in Leonard's memory. 84 Americans shot after they surrendered. Bodies in the snow, the knowledge that some enemies had already thrown away the rules, the promise he'd made to himself, never surrender, wasn't a slogan now. It was the only thing that felt solid in a world that had suddenly tilted on its axis. So instead of dropping his weapon, instead of turning pale and raising his hands, Leonard did something human beings sometimes do in the face of unspeakable dread. He laughed. At first, maybe it was a short, breathy burst, the sound of a mind cracking under pressure. Then it deepened, rolled up from his chest, shook his shoulders. The officer's face twisted with disbelief. Who laughs with a gun jammed into their gut? Leonard bent slightly at the waist, still laughing as if the entire scene were some dark, absurd joke. He called out to his men, "I don't know what he's saying," or something close to it. And his laughter grew louder, more unhinged. A few of the German soldiers watching began to laugh too, the tension cutting sideways instead of straight up. The absurdity of their furious officer yelling in German at a cackling American first sergeant was too much even for them. Discipline slipped, attention wavered. For a heartbeat, maybe 2, the iron grip of the moment loosened. Leonard used that sliver of chaos. Still laughing, he shifted his weight just enough to slip his hand under his overcoat. Somehow, in the confusion of earlier fighting and the capture of the guards, the Germans had missed his Thompson submachine gun. His fingers found the familiar grip and trigger. In one explosive motion, he shoved the MP40's barrel aside and yanked the Thompson up, stock slamming into his shoulder, muzzle barely inches from the German officer and the nearest soldiers. His finger squeezed the trigger. The yard erupted. The Thompson spat fire and lead, its harsh roar tearing through the frozen air. The first burst smashed into the officer and the men clustered closest to Leonard, dropping them where they stood. Spray from the muzzle blast and the sudden shock of sound at point-blank range tore the fragile illusion of control from the Germans. Leonard pivoted, firing in short, savage bursts into the mass of enemies packed only a few steps away. Men trying to raise rifles were cut down mid-motion. Others dove for cover, but found themselves crashing into their own comrades. Some simply froze, paralyzed by the speed with which the situation had flipped. Behind Leonard, the 4 kneeling Americans surged into action. Adrenaline erased their numbness. They lunged for the pile of weapons at their feet and in the snow, snatching up rifles, loading, firing into the confusion. The German plan to launch a coordinated ambush disintegrated in less than a minute. In that tight space, crowded with bodies, there was nowhere for them to form a proper firing line. Suddenly, the safe rear area they thought they controlled became a kill zone aimed squarely at them. When the echo finally died and the last few shots faded into distant artillery thunder, about 21 Germans lay dead in the yard. Many more were wounded or sprawled face down in the snow, hands pressed over their heads. The rest, shocked, demoralized, abruptly aware of how quickly their advantage had vanished, threw down their weapons and surrendered again. The 4 former guards, now rescuers, stood panting, hearts racing, fingers trembling on their triggers. The other American who had walked in with Leonard looked at him as if seeing him for the first time. The laughing first sergeant had done the impossible and dragged them all through the hole in reality with him. Word of what had happened in that farmhouse yard spread quickly through Company C and the broader regiment. Men swapped details, filled in gaps, argued over who saw what, how long it really took, how many Germans went down in those seconds of gunfire. What remained constant was the core truth. Leonard A. Funk Jr. had walked into 90 Germans, refused to give up, and single-handedly turned a near-certain massacre into a stunning victory. For his actions at Holzheim on January 20, 1940, Leonard was awarded the Medal of Honor. The citation spoke of extraordinary heroism and conspicuous gallantry. It recounted how he had attacked a vastly superior enemy force, killed and wounded many, and forced the surrender of the rest. But pieces of paper and polished medals, for all their meaning, can't fully capture the reality of that moment. The crunch of snow under boots, the cold metal of a gun pressed into a man's stomach, the sour taste of fear in his mouth, and the wild, defiant laugh that tore through it all. After the war, Leonard went home to Pennsylvania. He walked streets that had not known artillery. He stood in stores where no one knew the weight of the decorations on his chest unless he chose to tell them. Like so many veterans, he carried his war silently. He had a chest full of medals: Medal of Honor, Distinguished Service Cross, Silver Star, Bronze Star, Purple Hearts. Each represented a moment when he had stepped forward instead of back, a time when the safe choice had been to quit, and he hadn't. But day to day, he was simply another man at the grocery store, another face in a crowd of quiet heroes who came home and tried to live ordinary lives after doing extraordinary things. For those who served in his generation, heroism was rarely about grand speeches or movie scripts. It was about a series of decisions made in seconds, under pressure most people can barely imagine. Step out of the airplane, even though the flak is thick. Lead a band of lost men across enemy territory, even though your ankle is screaming. Charge 3 guns with 3 men because someone has to. Refuse to surrender when you're surrounded because you know what happened in a snowy field not so far away. And just once, in a Belgian farmhouse yard, look 90 armed enemies in the eye and laugh. That laugh, born of defiance, fear, absurdity, and unbreakable will, still echoes across the decades. For American veterans, especially those who served in World War II, it speaks to something deeply familiar. The knowledge that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act anyway. Leonard Funk's story is not just about one man's Mouaz medals. It is about the millions of quiet acts of bravery, visible and invisible, that carried a generation through the darkest war humanity has ever known.